Some stories of justice feel like they are set in stone. A verdict is delivered, a sentence handed down, and the world moves on. But sometimes, the truth waits in the shadows for decades, quietly building evidence, until it finally breaks free. This is the story of a man who spent over 30 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit, a crime he was convicted of, with shaky evidence, flawed testimony, and a system determined to close the case quickly. Every year behind bars chipped away at his life, his relationships, and his identity. Yet, even in the darkest moments, he never stopped hoping that someone, someday, would uncover the truth. And when they did, the revelations didn't just clear his name. They exposed corruption, mistakes, and blind spots in the very system that had condemned him. The crime that shocked the community. It began with a brutal crime that shook the town to its core. A local business owner was murdered late one evening. The details so gruesome, they made headlines for weeks. Neighbors reported hearing arguments, then the scream that signaled something terrible had happened. Investigators arrived quickly, piecing together a scene of violence that seemed chaotic, but in reality would later be revealed as almost staged. Amid the panic and pressure to solve the case, law enforcement focused on the first suspect, who matched a vague description. A man who lived nearby, known for minor offenses but nothing remotely violent. The community wanted closure, the media demanded answers, and the police felt the weight of expectation. They acted quickly, building the case with what evidence they could gather. But almost immediately, flaws emerged, eyewitness accounts conflicted, forensic evidence was thin, and yet the man was charged, tried, and convicted. The speed of it all would haunt him for decades, a life shattered by conviction. Once convicted, the man's life changed completely. The sentence was severe, and the prison system was unforgiving. Friends and family tried to support him, but as years turned into decades, many drifted away, unable to endure the relentless cycle of visitation, letters, and unending appeals. Inside prison walls, he became known as someone quiet, introspective, and resilient. He studied law books, learning the rules, the loopholes, and the strategies that might one day help him fight for freedom. He documented every memory, every inconsistency, every detail that might someday help prove his innocence. But the system was slow, and the world outside moved on. Every day behind bars was a reminder of a life stolen, lost birthdays, missed opportunities, and the certainty that most people had already written him off as guilty. Yet, even in those darkest years, he never admitted guilt, never confessed to a crime he didn't commit, and never lost hope that the truth could emerge. The first glimmer of hope. For years, requests for appeals were denied or delayed. Legal teams worked tirelessly, but resources were limited, and the courts were reluctant to reopen cases that had been settled. The first real breakthrough came in the form of new technology, DNA testing that didn't exist at the time of his conviction. Evidence collected at the original crime scene had been stored, but never fully analyzed, overlooked by investigators convinced of his guilt. When advocates finally gained access to the material, they discovered DNA that didn't match the convicted man. It belonged to someone else entirely. For the first time, hope flickered. But it wasn't enough to overturn decades of conviction on its own. The legal team needed witnesses, alibis, records, anything that could provide context and credibility. And that's when they found a retired detective who had worked the case in its earliest days. He admitted privately that critical evidence had been ignored and that pressure from superiors had influenced the investigation. The truth, long buried under bureaucracy and assumption, was finally beginning to surface. The evidence that changed everything. What ultimately tipped the scales wasn't just DNA, it was a combination of overlooked reports, misfiled documents, and testimonies that had been dismissed or discredited at the time. One witness, who had originally testified against the man, recanted under oath, admitting that their statement had been coerced by aggressive questioning and fear. Another witness revealed that law enforcement had failed to follow leads pointing to the real perpetrator, ignoring phone records and alibi confirmations that could have exonerated him. Each new revelation compounded the sense of injustice. It became clear that the conviction was not just a mistake, it was a systematic failure. Evidence that should have been central to the defense had been overlooked or suppressed. Investigators who had rushed to judgment were long gone. but the consequences of their actions were still very real. Slowly, the case that had once seemed closed began to reopen, piece by piece. The emotional return to freedom. After decades behind bars, the man finally walked out of prison with a court order declaring his conviction overturned. Cameras and reporters swarmed, but the moment was private and deeply personal. He was free, yes, but the world he returned to was almost unrecognizable. Cities had changed, old friends were gone, and family members had aged or passed. Reintegrating was a challenge both emotionally and psychologically. Yet, amidst the adjustment, there was relief, gratitude, and a sense of justice finally served. Every step outside prison walls was a reminder that the truth had finally prevailed. The man gave speeches, spoke to advocacy groups, and worked to raise awareness about wrongful convictions. But the fight wasn't only about him, it was about every person whose voice had been silenced by errors, pressure, or prejudice within the justice system. His freedom became both a personal triumph and a symbol for systemic change. The impact on the community and the system. The overturning of his conviction sent shockwaves through the local community and law enforcement. Many were forced to confront uncomfortable questions about biases, procedural mistakes, and assumptions made in the heat of pressure. Training protocols were revised, oversight increased, and cold case units began reviewing similar convictions. But the impact went further than policy, it forced reflection. Families of the wrongly convicted had to grapple with decades of lost time, while community members struggled to reconcile their initial certainty with the newly revealed truth. Newspapers ran retrospective stories, interviews examined failures, and documentaries highlighted the human cost of systemic error. And for the man himself, while no media coverage could ever return the decades he lost, it did help shine light on a system in need of scrutiny, reform, and empathy. The lessons of a long fight for justice. The story of a wrongful conviction overturned after decades is more than a legal case, it is a testament to perseverance, hope, and the relentless pursuit of truth. It shows how flawed systems, human error, and social pressures can combine to destroy lives, and how new evidence, combined with courage and advocacy, can restore what was stolen. It is also a cautionary tale for law enforcement and society alike. Assumptions, bias, and haste in judgment can have devastating, lasting consequences. But above all, it is a story of resilience, of a man who refused to accept an injustice as permanent, who refused to confess to a crime he did not commit, and who, even after decades of hardship, refused to give up hope that the truth would set him free. The personal cost behind freedom. Even after the court overturned his conviction, the personal cost of decades behind bars could not be erased. Time lost with family, the births of nieces and nephews he never held, friendships that faded, and the simple experiences of everyday life all stolen by a system that failed him. He struggled with trust, haunted by the thought that society had once condemned him without proof. Nights were the hardest, memories of isolation and injustice replayed endlessly. But slowly, he began reclaiming his life, reconnecting with loved ones, and finding purpose in helping others facing similar battles. Each smile, each hug, each quiet moment of normalcy became a victory over the years of silence and pain. And while no amount of advocacy, speeches, or reforms could return what he had lost, his resilience became a testament. Even after decades of injustice, the human spirit can endure, rebuild, and rise stronger than the system that tried to break it. And that is how a wrongful conviction, long believed to be settled, was finally overturned after decades, a story of perseverance, courage, and the relentless search for justice. It reminds us that the justice system is not infallible, that mistakes can destroy lives, and that truth can sometimes take a lifetime to surface. But it also proves that hope, patience, and persistence can triumph against staggering odds. If you want more stories that reveal the hidden truths behind crimes, injustice, and human resilience, stay with these investigations. Because sometimes, the truth waits silently for decades, and when it finally emerges, it doesn't just change one life, it changes everything we thought we knew about justice itself.